Ivy Callahan's hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel, and she'd been driving for 11 hours. The address on the paper said Coronado Creek Ranch, Dry Fork, Wyoming. Population 1,200, according to the sign she'd passed 3 miles back. The kind of town that felt like it was holding its breath. She'd been holding hers since she crossed the state line. She found the turnoff just before sunset. A dirt road that climbed slightly before the land opened up. Scrubby pasture. A windmill turning slow against a pink sky. A house that looked like it had been arguing with the weather for 50 years and losing. A barn bigger than the house. Fence posts leaning at angles that suggested a man who worked hard but couldn't be everywhere at once. A man stood on the porch, watching her car come up the drive. This was him. Declan Pruett, the widower, the rancher. The stranger she'd married 3 days ago by proxy, her signature on the left side of the certificate, his on the right, a notary in the middle. And not a single word spoken between them. Her first thought, stepping out of the car and seeing him in the last of the day's light. He looked like someone had carved him from the land itself. Not handsome exactly, weathered, like a fence post that had outlasted everything around it. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, not warmth, but not coldness either. Something more like caution. Her second thought, what have I done? He didn't move to help with her bags. He just watched. She got her duffel out herself, slung it over one shoulder, and crossed the gravel toward him. Up close, his eyes were the gray of a winter sky before snow. He had a jaw like a closing argument. You're Ivy. Not a question. You're Declan. He looked at her the way a man might look at a check engine light, not panicking, but not sure what to do next. You're younger than I expected. You're quieter. She shifted her bag to the other shoulder. Are you going to let me in, or should I sleep in the car? Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement. He stepped back and held the door. The inside of the house was clean in the way things get clean when someone stops caring what they look like. Functional, bare. The kind of clean that meant no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor, no evidence that anyone lived here who felt anything. A single coffee mug by the sink. One chair at the kitchen table that was clearly his, worn soft at the armrests. She set her bag down in the kitchen and looked around. How long since your wife passed? He went still in the way people do when a question finds the exact bruise. 4 years. I'm sorry. She meant it. She could see it in the house. The absence of a woman wasn't something you could paint over. You hungry? He said it like he wanted to move past the moment. I'm fine. I made chili. It's on the stove. She realized then that he'd cooked. That he'd known she was coming all day and had stood at that stove and made dinner. She didn't know what to do with that. They ate. He ate more than she expected, actually. She ate less. They didn't say much. Out the window, she could see the last light fading off the pasture and the dark coming in from the mountains like something patient that had been waiting all day. The arrangement, he said finally, setting down his spoon. My lawyer explained your situation. Visa status, the work permit issue. He looked at the table, not at her. I'm not. I want you to know I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be. What does that mean exactly? It means I need a partner on this ranch, someone who can help with the books, maybe the horses. I'm not, this isn't about anything else. He finally looked up. We'll have separate rooms. I put your things in the room at the end of the hall. She searched his face. It would have been easier, in a way, if he'd seemed calculating, predatory. She knew how to handle that. But he just looked tired and careful. What do you actually need? She asked. Not what the arrangement says. What do you actually need from me to make this work? He looked at her like she'd asked the question in a language he'd mostly forgotten. I need someone who shows up, he said, at last. Who doesn't vanish when it gets hard? She thought about the thing she was running from. The distance she needed to put between herself and Tulsa. I can do that. She slept in the room at the end of the hall. The mattress was old, but clean. There were extra blankets folded at the foot. He'd thought of that. She lay in the dark, listening to the sounds a ranch makes at night, the creak of the structure, something moving in the pasture, wind against glass, and told herself she'd made the right choice. She hadn't cried since she crossed into Colorado. She wasn't going to start now. Morning came hard and early. She woke to the sound of him already up, boots on floorboards, and she dressed fast and came out to find coffee ready. Strong. No note, but the cup was clearly for her. He was already out in the barn by the time she poured it. She drank it by the kitchen window, watching him move between the stalls. He worked the way some people pray, focused and quiet, like the work was a conversation he was having with something larger than himself. She put on her boots and went out. What needs doing? He looked up from the horse he was brushing. The horse was a dark bay mare with an attitude. She could tell by the way the animal was angled away from him, making him work for it. You know horses? My grandmother had them. I'm not expert, but I'm not afraid of them. He passed her the brush without another word. She spent the next 3 hours learning the rhythm of the place. He wasn't a talker, but he wasn't unfriendly either. He showed her things once, watched to make sure she had it, and then moved on. He didn't baby her. She respected that more than she expected to. By afternoon, she'd gone through 6 months of the ranch's financial records and found 3 separate places where he was leaving money on the table. Grazing fees he wasn't tracking. A tax credit he'd never filed for. A hay contract that had gone month to month when it should have been renegotiated 18 months ago. She brought it to him at supper. He looked at the papers for a long time, then looked at her. Where'd you learn to read books like this? My mother ran a diner. I did her accounting from the time I was 12. You're not an accountant. I didn't say I was. I said I know numbers. She tapped the tax form. This one alone is almost $3,000. You can still file an amended return. He was quiet. Then, how'd you end up here? Really? He said it carefully, like he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. The arrangement, I mean. Most women who do this, there's a reason beyond just paperwork. She considered telling him the short version, the safe version. Instead, she heard herself say something closer to the truth. I was engaged. To a man my family thought was wonderful, successful, well-connected. The kind of man that makes everyone around you say you're lucky. She folded the papers. He didn't think I needed to have opinions, or a bank account of my own, or friends he hadn't approved. She looked at the window. When I left, he made it very difficult. Contacts at the immigration office. He has money, and he knows how to use it to complicate things. She turned back to Declan. The arrangement gets me legal standing that's harder for him to disrupt. Distance doesn't hurt either. Declan was quiet for a moment. Is he dangerous? He's the kind of dangerous that doesn't leave marks people can see. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than she'd said. You're safe here, whatever that's worth coming from a stranger. It's worth something. She surprised herself saying it. More than you might think. They fell into a routine over the next week that felt strange in its normalcy. She kept the books, learned the horses, started helping with the morning and evening feeds. He fixed things. He was always fixing something. A gate hinge, a section of fence, a pipe in the barn that had been leaking since spring. He didn't make conversation exactly, but he talked when there was something to say, which she found she preferred to the kind of man who talked to fill silence. One evening she was sitting on the porch steps, going through the hay contract, when his neighbor's truck came up the drive. A man in his 60s, barrel-chested, with the particular look of someone who'd appointed himself the community's gatekeeper. He climbed out and squinted at her, before he even said hello. Heard Declan got himself a wife. He said it to her like it was an accusation. And you are? Roy Fenner. Run the property to the north. Been here 30 years. Known Declan since he was half-grown. His eyes moved over her in assentment. You're young. You're observant. She stood, wiped her hands on her jeans. Roy, I'm Ivy. It's good to meet you. Declan appeared from the barn. Roy turned to him. What is this, Declan? People are talking. People are always talking, Roy. What do you need? I need to know what's going on. You didn't tell a soul you were getting married. Nobody knows this woman. She just shows up in a foreign car, and now she's your wife. Roy kept looking at Ivy like she was something he wanted to return. You're a grown man, but you've been alone a long time. Grief does things to judgment. Ivy felt her jaw tighten, but before she could say anything, Declan stepped up beside her. Not touching her, just beside her. Close enough that Roy had to look at both of them together. What exactly are you implying? Declan's voice was very level. I'm implying that a young woman shows up out of nowhere, and within a month you're married. That raises questions. Legal ones. What she's after. Ivy stepped forward. What I'm after, Roy, is a life that doesn't involve explaining myself to men who've decided the answer before they asked the question. She kept her voice pleasant. My husband and I have an arrangement that's legal and real and none of your business. If you have an actual concern about the ranch or about Declan, I'll leave you two to discuss it. If you're just here to inventory me, then we're done. Roy's mouth opened and closed. He looked at Declan. She's right, Declan said. You have something you need, Roy. Roy left 10 minutes later, after extracting what information he needed about a shared fence line. When his truck disappeared around the bend, Ivy let out a long breath. He'll tell everyone in town you married a suspicious woman who showed up with nothing. He'll tell everyone in town you gave him what he deserved. Declan almost smiled. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She sat back down on the steps. Men like Roy count on people not doing that. Declan was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. Carolyn, my wife, she would have made Roy tea and let him feel like he won. Ivy looked up at him. It was the first time he'd said her name. Did that work? Mostly. He sat down on the step beside her, which surprised her. She was better with people than I am, knew how to make everyone feel important without losing herself. It was a skill I never had. He paused. You don't have it either, but for different reasons. I used to, she said. I spent 3 years making one person feel important and forgot how to stop. She turned the hay contract in her hands. What was she like, Caroline? He looked at the mountains. Stubborn, funny in this way that snuck up on you. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished them, which sounds annoying, but it wasn't. He stopped. She was the one who wanted this place. I grew up on a ranch, but I'd gotten a job in Cheyenne, doing land survey work. She's the one who said we should come back, build something real. We were 6 months into it when she got sick. I'm sorry. Cancer. He said the word like it was a door he'd opened so many times it barely registered anymore. 11 months start to finish. 11 months. She did not know what else to say to that. What was there? I kept the place because she wanted it, he said. First 2 years I was just keeping it alive out of stubbornness. Now I don't know what I'm keeping it for. She looked at him. This man sitting next to her on the steps of a house he'd kept standing by sheer refusal to quit. She thought about what it meant to stay somewhere after everything that made it a home was gone. Maybe you keep it until you figure that out, she said. He looked at her. Then back at the mountains. Yeah, maybe. That night she lay in the room at the end of the hall and thought about the fact that she was starting to care what happened to Declan Pruett's ranch. That was either very good or very bad. She hadn't figured out which. 3 weeks in, she was walking the north pasture with him to assess a section of fence when the black SUV appeared at the end of the drive. Her stomach dropped before she even knew why. It was the plates. Oklahoma. She knew those plates. She stopped walking. Ivy. Declan noticed immediately. What's wrong? That car. He looked, then back at her. His voice was very quiet. Is that him? A man got out, mid-40s. Expensive casual, the kind of clothes that announced money without shouting it. Dark hair. Cold posture, a smile that went on before his eyes did. He looked around the property the way you'd look at something you were about to negotiate down. Ivy. He said it like a greeting, crossing the pasture toward them. I've been looking for you. Her hands were completely still. She'd learned, in 3 years, that stillness was safer than shaking. Preston, you look good. He stopped at a reasonable distance, taking in Declan beside her. You must be the husband, Preston Langley. He offered his hand. Declan didn't take it. What do you want? Preston smiled. I just want to talk to Ivy. A conversation between two people who have some things to sort out. There's nothing to sort out. Ivy heard her own voice come out steady and was grateful for it. We sorted everything out when I left. You left with some things that belong to me. I left with my own property, including documentation that's relevant to our financial arrangements. His voice stayed pleasant. It always stayed pleasant. That was the thing about Preston. He never raised his voice. He never had to. Ivy, I don't want to make this difficult. I just want what's mine. There's nothing here that belongs to you, Declan said. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice either. But there was something in how he placed himself. Between her and Preston, not obviously, just there. That made the dynamic clear. You should leave. Preston looked at him with the particular contempt of a man who decided another man wasn't worth real contempt. You don't actually know what you've gotten yourself into here. This woman has. She's my wife. Declan said it the way you'd say a fact about the weather. Absolute. Requiring no support. And you're on private property. I'll ask once more. Preston's pleasant expression held a moment longer. Then he looked at Ivy. You think a piece of paper and a Wyoming address makes you safe. It doesn't. He said it quietly, just for her. We're not done. He got back in the SUV. They watched it go. Ivy realized she'd been holding her breath for approximately 3 minutes. He'll come back, she said. I know. He has lawyers, real ones. He'll find something, some angle, some way to make the marriage look fraudulent, or your finances look compromised, or he's very good at finding angles. What did he mean about documentation? She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. When I left, I had access to records from his business. He runs a development company, legitimate on the surface, but I found things, payments to county officials to secure zoning variances, contracts that were bid at inflated rates and funneled back to shell companies he controls. It's not small. She turned to look at Declan. I gave copies to a journalist before I left Tulsa. I haven't heard back about whether anything's been published, but he knows I had them. That's what he wants. Declan was quiet for a long moment, looking down the road where the SUV had gone. Does the journalist have enough to run with it? I don't know. I haven't been able to contact her since I left. I was worried about leaving a trail. We need to contact her. He said it simply, like it was the next obvious step. If she's ready to publish, Preston's going to know where the leak came from. He's going to come at this place, at us, at everything we. She stopped, because she'd said we and meant it, and that surprised her. Declan looked at her. Or we wait and let him squeeze us until we have no choices left. He picked up a fence post he'd been carrying, drove it into the ground with 2 precise blows. I've spent 4 years letting things happen to me. I'm done with that. They drove into town the next morning for supplies and ran straight into judgment. The woman at the hardware store looked at Ivy, the way women sometimes look at women they've decided are guilty of something. The man at the feed store was friendlier but asked too many questions. She could feel the narrative forming around them. The widow's rancher and the strange young woman, the quick marriage. The rumors Roy Fenner had clearly already distributed. A woman came up to them outside the post office. About 60, kind face, sharp eyes. She introduced herself as Bev Hollander, who had apparently taught Declan in 4th grade and had therefore earned a standing invitation to say whatever she liked. You must be the wife, she said to Ivy, appraising her with the directness of a woman who'd stopped pretending to be indirect decades ago. Declan doesn't do anything without a good reason. I'm a judgment. That's the most I can ask, Ivy said. Bev almost smiled. You can ask for my recommendation of the pie at Lena's diner that you've earned by not being an idiot. She turned to Declan. This one's smarter than the last 3 decisions you made. Don't waste it. Then she walked into the post office. Declan looked at the door she'd gone through. I have no idea if that was an endorsement or a warning. Both, I think. Ivy looked at him sideways. Did you actually make 3 bad decisions? She means the water heater situation, a horse I bought that turned out to be mean, and a grain contract in 2021 that I try not to think about. That's actually reassuring. How? Because you've made bad decisions and survived them. Makes you seem more real. He glanced at her as they walked back to the truck. Have I not seemed real until now? She thought about how to answer that. You've seemed like someone standing slightly outside of your own life, watching it from the edge. He unlocked the truck and didn't say anything, but he didn't argue. Preston moved fast. 3 days later, a letter arrived from a lawyer in Tulsa, addressed to both of them, questioning the validity of their marriage and suggesting that Ivy had entered the arrangement under false pretenses. It was vague enough to be legal and specific enough to be a threat. The same day, the county assessor's office sent a notice of inquiry into the ranch's property tax exemption, something they'd apparently never questioned in 20 years. That's not a coincidence, Declan said, reading both letters at the kitchen table. No, she sat across from him. He's using his contacts. He knows people who know how to make paperwork get filed. He bought influence in Wyoming. He buys influence everywhere. That's how he operates. She put her hands flat on the table. Declan, I need to tell you something. The whole thing, she told him. The full 3 years of it. How she'd met Preston at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, which was exactly the kind of detail he used, always. How charming he'd been. How slow the erosion was. So slow she hadn't named it for almost a year. The way he'd separated her from her friendships, so gradually she'd blamed herself for losing them. The bank account he'd convinced her to close because joint finances were more efficient. The way he talked about her in front of other people, always complimentary, always with a slight edge that reminded her of her place. The moment she knew, overhearing a phone call where he discussed using a city council contact to kill an environmental review that would have blocked one of his developments. Not just influence, corruption, and the understanding that she was living inside that machine, that her name was on things she hadn't known were dirty. Declan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "You didn't go to the police," he said. "He owns 3 people in the Tulsa DA's office. I found that in the same records." She looked at her hands, and I was ashamed of how long I stayed, of how much I let him diminish me before I recognized it. That's not something to be ashamed of. I know that now. I knew it then too. Knowing doesn't make the feeling go away. Declan looked at her across the table. "What happened to the woman, the journalist you gave the records to? Her name is Teresa Maddox. She was with an investigative outlet in Oklahoma City. I gave her everything I had, scanned files, email threads, 2 recorded phone calls. Then I left. You've had no contact since. I didn't want to lead anyone to her." Declan was quiet for a moment. "We need to find out if she's still working the story. And we need to do it before Preston's lawyers file anything formal that can actually stick. If she publishes, he's going to know it came from me. He already knows. That's why he's here." He pushed back from the table. "Ivy, he's not going to stop. Men like that don't stop. The only thing that actually stops them is exposure." She knew he was right. She'd known it since the SUV with Oklahoma plates had appeared at the end of the drive. "Okay," she said. "We contact Teresa." They drove to the next county and bought a prepaid phone with cash at a truck stop. She called Teresa's number from memory. She'd had 3 months to memorize it, and got voicemail. She left a message, her first name only, the code phrase they'd agreed on if she ever needed to reach out. She threw the phone in a dumpster behind a fast food restaurant, and they drove home in silence. Teresa called back in 6 hours. Not on the prepaid, on Declan's landline, which meant she'd tracked them, which meant she was thorough. "I've been sitting on this for 3 months waiting to hear from you," Teresa said, voice low and quick. "You fell off the map. I had to. The story's ready to run. I've had 2 more sources come forward since you disappeared. Independent verification on the zoning schemes and the contract inflation. This is real, Ivy, and it's big." "He's here," Ivy said. "In Wyoming. He showed up at the ranch." Silence on the other end. Then, "Did he threaten you?" Vaguely. "He's good at vague. If I run this now, he's going to retaliate. You understand that, if you don't run it now, he's going to dismantle our marriage, our finances, and anything else he can reach. So I'd say the timeline has changed." She looked across the kitchen at Declan, who was leaning against the counter listening. "Run it." The story went up 2 days later. Not local, not regional, it landed in a national outlet because Teresa had done the work, and the work was extraordinary. Financial corruption in Tulsa's development sector. A paper trail of bribery, bid rigging, payments to public officials across 3 counties. And at the center of it, Preston Langley, whose name and photograph appeared in the 3rd paragraph. The phones started ringing that afternoon, reporters wanting comment. The ranch's landline, Declan's cell, 2 neighbors calling to say they'd seen the article, and was it true? Bev Hollander drove out personally with a coffee cake, and the news that her cousin in the county assessor's office had already been informed that the property inquiry was politically motivated. "Word travels," Bev said, setting the cake on the counter. "This is a small state. People don't like it when outsiders come in and start pulling strings." Preston's lawyers filed 3 things in the next 48 hours. Ivy and Declan sat at the kitchen table with Declan's attorney, a deliberate man named Crawford who'd driven an hour from Sheridan and read everything carefully before speaking. "The marriage challenge has no real standing," Crawford said. "You're legally married. The ceremony was valid. The documentation is clean. Unless they can demonstrate fraud, which requires proving your intent at the time of filing, this goes nowhere." "And the tax inquiry?" "Already withdrawn, actually. The assessor's office called this morning." Crawford looked at Ivy. "The publication of that article has complicated things for anyone who was doing Langley's bidding. People who were willing to file paperwork quietly are not willing to be named in a corruption investigation." "So it worked," Ivy said. "The exposure worked, yes." Crawford put his papers away. "What you should expect now is that Langley will try one more direct approach before he accepts that it's over. Men in his position, they have to try. It's psychological. They're not wired to simply accept a loss." He was right. Preston came back that night. He came with 2 other men, associates, lawyers, something, and he knocked on the front door at 9:15 p.m. like it was a business call. Declan answered it. Ivy stood in the hallway. "I want to talk to my wife," Preston said. "Alone." "She's not your wife," Declan said. "I want to hear it from her." Ivy walked to the door. She stood beside Declan. Looked at Preston, this man who had once felt enormous, whose approval had once felt necessary, who had taken up so much space in her mind that there'd been barely room for her. He looked smaller out here, not small, but smaller. "You wasted a trip," she said. "You've made things very difficult for a lot of people." His voice was even, "including yourself. The people around you, this ranch." He looked past her into the house. "This doesn't have to end badly for everyone." "It already ended," Ivy said. "3 months ago when I walked out. The article is going to be challenged. Teresa Maddox's sources are going to be questioned. This whole story could fall apart in 6 months, and then where are you?" "In Wyoming," she said, "with my husband, working a ranch." Something shifted in his expression. Not defeat, not yet. But the first crack in the surface. He'd expected fear. She could see it in the way he'd prepared for this conversation. The particular cadence of a man who'd mapped out an emotional landscape and arrived to find the terrain had changed. "Ivy, you should go," Declan said. Not loud, just final. Preston looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that was meant to communicate something about power and staying in your lane. Declan looked back at him the way the land looked back at everything. Patient, unmoved, there long before this moment and planning to be there long after. Preston left. The 2 men with him followed without having said a single word. The next morning, federal investigators made contact with Teresa. Not to challenge the story, to corroborate it. One of the officials named in the article had decided that cooperation was preferable to exposure and had started talking. 3 weeks later, Preston Langley was indicted on 4 counts of bribery of public officials and 2 counts of fraud. His development company's assets were frozen pending investigation. Ivy read about it on her phone at the kitchen table. Declan poured her coffee and read the article over her shoulder. "It's over," she said. She said it slowly, like she was testing the words for weight. "For him, yeah." He set the coffee pot down. "Doesn't mean it's over for you, that kind of thing." He paused, choosing carefully. "It takes time to shake off." She looked up at him. "You sound like you know. Grief isn't that different from what you're describing. Someone taking up space in you until they're just gone, and the space stays." He sat down across from her. "You get used to it eventually. The space becomes yours again." She thought about 3 years of erosion. Of silences she'd learned to fill before they could be used against her. Of the slow work of becoming smaller so someone else could feel larger. "I keep waiting to feel different," she said. "Like it should feel like something." It does feel like something. Just not all at once. Outside, the mare she'd been working with, she'd named her Pepper, unofficially, because she had opinions, was moving along the fence line in the morning light. The land was gold at that hour, the way Wyoming gets gold in the fall, and the mountains sat behind all of it like they'd been there since before anyone had words for staying. The cooperative she'd been building with 3 neighboring ranches, a direct sales arrangement that cut out 2 layers of middleman markup, was closing its first major order. 48 hours of phone calls, 2 spreadsheets she'd built from scratch, and a handshake with a restaurant group in Jackson that wanted local, traceable beef. Crawford had told her it was one of the smarter things he'd seen a new operation put together in years. She'd said she'd learned from watching smart people make preventable mistakes. She'd also sent Roy Fenner a detailed proposal for a shared grazing rotation that would benefit both properties significantly. He'd called twice to argue about the details, which she took as acceptance. On a Tuesday evening in October, she was sitting on the porch steps doing math on the back of an envelope when Declan came and sat beside her. The same spot they'd sat before, the evening after Roy's first visit. "Crawford's drafting the amended tax filing," she said. "We should get close to 3,000 back." "I know," he called. He looked out at the land. "I've been thinking." "About?" He was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was working his way towards something that mattered. She'd learned to wait. "When Caroline died," he said finally, "I stopped thinking about the ranch as mine. It was ours and then she was gone and it became, I don't know, a thing I maintained, like a grave I kept up out of obligation." Ivy put the envelope down. "You said something, that first week. That maybe I keep it until I figure out what I'm keeping it for." He looked at her sideways. "I think I figured it out." "What did you figure out?" "It's not about the land. It was never really about the land. It was about whether I still believed in building something." He paused. "Turns out I do. Turns out I needed to remember how." She was aware of how close they were sitting, of how natural it had gotten, the proximity of him, the particular steadiness of someone who occupied space honestly. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay, when I agreed to this arrangement, I told myself it was purely practical, legal status, distance, time to rebuild." She folded the envelope, and it was practical. But somewhere, I don't know when exactly, somewhere between the financial records and the fence posts and Roy Fenner getting his comeuppance, it stopped being only that. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She looked at him. "The night Preston showed up," he said, "I realized I wasn't angry because he was a legal complication. I was angry because he'd hurt you, and he stopped. "That's different. It's different," she agreed. They sat there for a while in the long autumn dusk, not touching, but close. Pepper moved in the pasture below. The windmill turned in the slow way it always turned, indifferent to everything. "I should warn you," Ivy said eventually. "I'm not easy. I don't know how to be in something real after 3 years of something that wasn't. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. You're going to reorganize my filing system. I already reorganized your filing system. I know. I couldn't find the propane invoices for a week." He paused. "They're in a much more logical place now." She laughed, genuine, surprised. He smiled in response, an actual smile, which she'd learned to recognize as rare, and therefore worth something. "I'm going to get it wrong too," he said. "I'll go quiet when I should talk. I'll focus on what's broken instead of what's working. Caroline used to say I treated problems like fences. If I just fixed enough of them, eventually I'd have fixed everything." He looked at the pasture. "That's not how people work." "No," she agreed. "But it's not a bad instinct. Just incomplete. Just incomplete." The indictment of Preston Langley made regional news for 3 weeks and then settled into the slower rhythm of a legal process that would unfold over a year at least. Ivy stopped checking the updates daily, then weekly. She didn't stop caring about the outcome, but she stopped carrying it everywhere. The cooperative's first quarter numbers came in stronger than she'd projected. 3 ranches, combined, had increased their net revenue by enough that 2 of the families were talking about delayed improvements they'd been putting off. A new hay barn, a water system upgrade. A 4th ranch signed on, then a 5th. One morning, she found Declan at the kitchen table with a coffee and a yellow legal pad, writing something. He looked up when she came in, slightly embarrassed, like she'd caught him at something private. "What is that?" He turned the pad to show her. It was a list of the things the ranch did well, and a list of things it could do better. Business planning, roughly. Not sophisticated, but honest. "I've been trying to think like someone who expects to win," he said, "instead of someone waiting to lose." She sat down. "Can I see?" They worked through it together over 2 cups of coffee and a plate of toast, adding and crossing out and rearranging. She showed him how she'd been thinking about the cooperative's expansion. He showed her a grazing rotation model he'd developed over the winter that she hadn't known about. Between the 2 of them, they had something that looked like an actual strategy. "We should show Crawford," she said. "We will." He looked at the legal pad. "It's strange. What is having plans?" He folded the pad. "I forgot what it felt like." She understood that. She'd spent 3 years making herself into someone else's plan. Learning to want things for herself again had required more deliberate effort than she'd expected. 6 months after she'd arrived in Dry Fork, Ivy stood in the same spot she'd parked when she first drove up the dirt road. The pasture was different. Winter had come and gone, and the grass was coming back, green-gray in the early light. The windmill was turning. Pepper was in the near pasture, watching her with the mare's characteristic air of mild disdain for human behavior. Declan came around the side of the barn. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd watch the sun come up." He came to stand beside her. They looked at the land together, the scrubby pasture, the fence lines, the mountains going from dark to gold as the light came. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't owe me anything. Let me finish." She turned to look at him. "When I drove up that road, I was running away from something. I told myself the arrangement was practical and mutual, and nobody needed to get invested. I told myself that because I was afraid of needing anything from anyone." She paused. "You made it very hard to stay afraid." He looked at her, that steady, careful look he had. "You made it hard to stay closed off," he said. "Which is annoying because I was doing fine. You were not doing fine." "I was maintaining isn't fine, Declan." "No," he said. "It's not." He turned back to the mountains. "I hadn't. Since Caroline, I hadn't let myself want something to work out. Something with another person. He said it plainly, the way he said all the things that mattered, without performance. That's changed. Because of me? Because of you showing up and deciding this place was worth figuring out. Because you looked at the books and found $3,000 I'd left on the table and brought it to me like it was obvious. Because you told Roy Fenner exactly where to direct his suspicions. He paused. Because when Preston came back that second time and you stood in that doorway, you were the one who made him leave, not me. You. You were right there. I was there. You were the one who made it real. She thought about what it meant, to stay. To build something slowly, out of work and difficulty, and the particular intimacy of shared stakes. This wasn't a thing that had happened to her. It was a thing she had chosen, morning by morning, fence post by fence post, in the quiet rhythm of a life that had started as an arrangement and become something truer than most things she'd planned. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded once. Certain. Good. And then, because he was not a man who overstated things, "Neither am I." Pepper chose that moment to come to the fence and stare at them with obvious impatience. "She wants her morning feed," Ivy said. "She always wants her morning feed. She has opinions. She has the opinions of someone who's never faced a consequence in her life." But he was smiling when he said it. Declan's small, real, rare smile. Ivy Callahan. Ivy Pruett, now on the tax filings and the cooperative letterhead, and the deed that Crawford had amended 3 months in, walked toward the barn to start the morning. The work was waiting. It was always waiting, and she had stopped minding that. She had stopped running. And it turned out that was the bravest thing she'd ever done.